Hi there, folks. Steve here, and let's talk through this really fascinating documentary, Searching for Sugar Man. It is, of course, an Academy Award winner, whatever that means, if it even means anything. The Academy have often awarded very peculiar films as the best film of the year, but let's not get into that right now. This is, of course, the star of the film, the social actor Rodriguez. It's kind of, it would be a more appropriate shot if this shot of him, which was a publicity still for the film, was actually of his back, because early in the film there's footage of Rodriguez on stage with his back turned towards the camera, and I think that really sets up this sort of person. And the fact that he wasn't someone like, say, a Dylan or a Mick Jagger, who was really hungry for fame and wanted to be a sort of a superstar. Rodriguez was a very nervous performer and public person, and he really didn't want to get too involved in the celebrity of his work. So much so that when the film won Best Documentary at the Academy Awards, he didn't turn up. He didn't want to get on stage because, well, he said he didn't want to take the attention away from the filmmakers because it's their film. But I think it says something about him and the lack of hunger that he really has for the limelight, which is really what the film is exploring. Now, the real question, the thing about this film is, as a piece of storytelling, it's fantastic and it works on a number of levels. The thing about this film is the social context and the way that a lot of documentaries ask you to have an understanding of the social context of the film that they're exploring. But for a film like Searching for Sugar Man, it plays more like a fiction film, where the less you know about it going in, the more enjoyable your experience is going to be. If you go on Wikipedia and you read up on Rodriguez and the film, and then you go into the documentary, you will probably be quite disappointed by it, because there are some holes in the way that the history or the truth and the ethics around that have been constructed. But like I said, as a piece of storytelling, it's really effective. And I want to think about that, the difference between watching a documentary and watching a fiction film, and the way that in fiction film, the last thing you want to do is find out the ending before you've seen it, where in documentary, it's almost a given that you will understand where this story is going to end. And Searching for Sugar Man does not work, it doesn't play by that rule. It plays more by the rule of fiction. There's something about this film, and it always, I know it's happening when I'm watching the film, and I feel myself being completely manipulated by this movie, completely. But I'm okay with that. I sort of just get taken away by it. And again, it's a bit like watching, a James Bond film or something like that. The whole thing, the whole construction is kind of silly and a bit stupid, but there's something so enjoyable about it, and you're willing to be taken away on this experience. And there's something about that with this film for me, where I know what's happening. I know there are certain people in it whose stories do not ring true. And there's a point in this film when I'm watching it and I'm thinking, did this even happen? Like, is this just a mockumentary? Because the way they talk about Rodriguez, I should know all about him. And I don't. I didn't know anything about this before I went into watching this for the first time. So there's something about that. Think about that when you're watching the film, how you're being manipulated. For all of its many deficiencies, the film represents some aspects of the South African social and historical landscape quite interestingly. And that's been a criticism of the film, the way that South Africa and South Africans have been depicted and is depicted. But there are some interesting depictions going on here, and it does ask some interesting questions. It may not go into the film in as much detail as many would like. Certainly, people interested in the cultural history, but it does at least raise some interesting points of view. which I think have been dismissed too easily, and they shouldn't be. But I ask here what the film is really about, and the film isn't really. It's. I mean, it is about South African social historical landscape, but it's not. It's really about a musician. It's about the detective story of them trying to uncover this musician who is obscure, and is he even alive? And the film plays as a detective. But the film is far more interested in the social pop culture references and story more really than the South African story. So the film could, you can absolutely criticise the film for actually not going into the South African politics as deeply as it could have. But if you think of the film, what it's really interested in doing, it's not actually about South Africa. This is a screenshot from Rotten Tomatoes, and you will see the tomato meter, which is the critics' consensus, gives that 94%, which is extremely high. So that's all of the reviews, that give a rating, and they sort of, find out the medium score, which is 94, and the audience score is 92, which is, again, excruciatingly high. Not excruciatingly high, but extremely high for a documentary. Documentaries aren't generally as high as what you'd see. So Searching for Sugar Man, really, at the time of its release, was a critical and an audience favourite. And I think you'll enjoy the experience of watching it, because there is something really, really enjoyable about watching. Watching this. Also, you can see on the sort of the top rentals, you've got Tanner, which is an Australian film, but that's really an aside. Just caught my eye there, which is an Australian documentary, also nominated for Academy Award. I'm now babbling, so let's move on. The problem of the social context, and like I said, the thing about this film is the less you actually know about Rodriguez and this period, and the story that the film is telling, the more enjoyable you're going to enjoy. You're going to like this film. If you know that Rodriguez is popular in Australia in the 1970s, and he toured there in 1979, 1980s, Midnight Oil, you will really start to ask some questions about the film. The more you question the film as the film plays, the more it's going to fall apart for you, right? And the film is saying, can we just go on with this story? Can we just tell you a good story? Does it have to always be the probing and the documentary stopping and asking questions about its own worth as a documentary? Can we just use the documentary form to tell you a good story? There is something very contrived about the film, but at the same time, perhaps if you use the assessment criteria for the way that other documentaries are judged, there's something that it's actually going to fall apart for you. And I think that's really interesting, and perhaps why the film is so popular, because people who don't normally like documentaries can actually get sucked into the storytelling of this film. I think the film says something about America and how it's established in the film. Rodriguez was sort of up and coming, and then he just disappeared, and he didn't go on, obviously, to have the career of, say, Bob Dylan. And there's something about the fans in the movie and the way the movie is constructed, which is very much, if you're not popular in America, if you're obscure in American popular culture, you don't actually exist. And it's obviously that's not true, because on a national scale, Rodriguez was still very popular. He was very popular in South Africa, he was very popular in Australia and New Zealand. So it's a real kind of conceit, I think, of the film, and the way that popular culture is often looked at through America. there's something also about apartheid in South Africa and the way that South Africans were closed from the outside. The fact that Rodriguez was really popular in South Africa. South Africans had no idea he wasn't popular anywhere else. He wasn't popular in America. And I think the film is interested in exploring that, exploring the closed world that South Africans lived through apartheid. So, what are the important issues that Searching for Sugar Man raises about South African society and political change? And I think that's really worth discussing and talking through. Now, there is a very simplistic portrayal of the anti-apartheid struggle and its disingenuous evasion of racial politics. It it raises these racial issues and racial politics, but it doesn't actually go in any profound detail, and that is what frustrates a lot of people with the film. Now, there's Stephen Sugerman, who's no related to Sugarman, portrays the musicians' songs as sort of anthems of a revolution, right? So this guy is championing Rodriguez as the great unsung hero and the guy that should be celebrated because at the time his songs were anthems for this revolution. But where the film doesn't continue with that idea and that championing is it doesn't establish a revolution by whom. It's never made clear. And something else the film doesn't even seem to be aware of is the whiteness of this storytelling. The fact that all the fans we encounter are white. All of the filmmakers were white. It's a white, like, fanboys take on Rodriguez. But race never comes into it. The fact that you've got these white fans and why are they so excited about Rodriguez and the way that he seemed to represent an anti-establishment is never really taken up through race. And that's really interesting. Like, if Rodriguez doesn't continue to be really successful in America at a time when many, many others like him, and you could argue less talented, were coming up, does that have something to do with race? And the film never goes there, which is a disappointment. Also, when it's talking about his South African following, it doesn't actually talk about who in South Africa followed him, but which demographics followed him, which again is disappointing. And really, in South Africa, with Rodriguez being, he's not a white guy, the revolt there was a black revolt. It was driven by racial oppression. And the film, I'm asking, does the film satisfactorily cover this? And think about that. Think about the way that the film sets these things up, but it doesn't go into great detail. Now, it doesn't need to go into great detail. That's really the question. And if the question is that this film is actually about, it's a rock story, it's a music story, it's a detective story, and the film can only really, sort of skim over those issues, and that's not really the central element of the film, so it doesn't really matter. So think about that. I just want to talk more about these anthems of a revolution and the way that the film sort of sets up the significance of Rodriguez. And the film collapses a much wider set of issues into the figure of Rodriguez. He becomes his representation for this great anti-establishment movement. But what's important to know is he wasn't a singular countercultural voice, right, that the film makes out. And I don't really know why the film tries to make that argument, because clearly we all know that Rodriguez is around at a time when you've got all of these other musicians, like, your John Lennon, the Stones, Dylan, Hendrix, Clapton, Joni Mitchell, Led Zeppelin, all of these bands in the 60s. And he was part of that. He was part of this, this moment and this time and this great period of music. And I don't really know why the film tries to single him out. Again, does it have to do with race? Like Jimi Hendrix said that he left America to go and live in London because in America he was always a black guy. He was always the black musician. And there was a sense of tokenism in what was going on, and he felt at times he was being completely patronised. So he went to London because he said in London there's a much stronger acceptance of race, and with the strong jazz scene there in London, he was really interested in moving into that. Enough on Jimi Hendrix, but again, the film doesn't really set that up, which is quite interesting. And Rodriguez's race is never explored. So just a final thought, something we can sort of take into broader discussions, is Rodriguez a public or a private figure? And when we're talking about social actors, it's important to establish, is this a private figure who's becoming a public figure through the film, or are they a public figure? And the question I'm really trying to get to is, who has the right to represent whom, right? What depths of intimate exploration are acceptable here? Is there an area of privacy not appropriate for documentary filmmakers to look into? Rodriguez is a guy who doesn't want the limelight, yet here is a film hunting him down, following him like he has a service to be a public figure again. And I think there's something a little uneasy about that. These films, there's a whole range of them. There was one on Salinger where they were searching for Salinger. And if they want to be left alone, shouldn't they be left alone? And the final question is, should there be a different set of ethical rules involved in the filming of public and private figures? And this film becomes really interesting when you compare it to something like, To Be and To Have, about a private school teacher. And Rodriguez is interesting because he's both the public figure and the private figure in one sense. And, I'll sort of return to that image of him on stage with his back to the audience. He's in a public setting, but he's very private in what he's doing. And I think that becomes really interesting, again, with the film. Okay, I think there's some interesting ideas there to unpack further. I think that Searching for Sugar Man, fascinating piece of storytelling. And I love the way that it actually blurs this whole idea of how you're watching a documentary as a fiction film, which is really, really interesting. But, of course, it sets itself up for a lot of criticism. Okay, we'll leave it there. See you soon.